You're standing in Africa. It's 170,000 BC. It is not cold. But someone in your group just wrapped a piece of animal skin around their shoulders, and everyone is staring. Not because they're impressed, because they've never seen anything like that before. That moment, that exact moment, is where clothing begins. Not in a cave, not in a blizzard, on a warm afternoon in sub-Saharan Africa. Be honest, the last time you got dressed, did you pick what was practical or what made you look a certain way? Don't answer yet, because the answer is going to get complicated. For most of human history, the explanation for clothes was simple. Cold climate, animal skin, problem solved. It made sense. It was obvious. It was completely wrong. Here's where it gets strange. The evidence that rewrote the whole story didn't come from a fossil. It didn't come from an ancient piece of fabric. It came from a louse, a body louse, Pediculus humanus corporis. The single most hated insect in human history accidentally became its best historian. In 2011, researchers at the University of Florida ran DNA analysis on body lice from populations around the world. They were looking for the moment when body lice split off from head lice. Because body lice can only live in fabric. They need it to survive. They lay their eggs in it. No fabric, no body lice. Simple as that. So the moment body lice first appeared is the moment humans first had something to wear. And the DNA pointed to one date, 170,000 years ago. The problem with that number? The first migration of humans into cold climates happened 70,000 years later. That's 100,000 years before anyone needed clothes to survive a winter. Think about what that means. Humans were wearing clothes for 100,000 years before the cold made it necessary. So what was it for? Let's back up even further. Because before anyone wore clothes, humans were already decorating their bodies. Archaeologists working in Pinnacle Point, South Africa, found something remarkable. Deposits of red ochre, a natural pigment, ground up and ready to use, dating to 164,000 years ago. That's before clothes. People were painting themselves before they were covering themselves, which means from the very beginning, the body wasn't just a body. It was a message, and clothing was the next version of that message. Getting a piece of animal skin ready to wear was not a 5-minute job. You killed the animal. You scraped the hide with a stone for days. You dried it. You stretched it. You worked it until it was soft enough to wear. Weeks of work for one garment. You get dressed in 30 seconds and still think about how you have nothing to wear. Stop and think about that. Now, here's what's interesting about who actually wore that first piece of animal skin. Anthropologists studying early human groups have found a consistent pattern. High-status individuals wore things that others didn't, not because they were warmer, because they looked different. There's a term for this: costly signaling. The idea that you wear or carry something expensive or difficult to obtain, not to survive, but to show others what you can afford to waste. A piece of leather took weeks to make. Wearing it said, "I had the time and skill and resources to do this." It said, "I'm not the one who went hungry this winter." Sound familiar? It should. That is you. Last Saturday. But here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. The first needle with an eye, meaning a needle that could actually sew fabric together, was found in Denisova Cave, Siberia. It dates to roughly 50,000 years ago. 50,000 years. That needle is less than 7 centimeters long, and it's made from the bone of a bird. Someone sat down, carved bone into a needle thinner than a matchstick, and drilled a hole through the end of it. With stone tools. Let that sit with you for a second. That's not desperation. That's craftsmanship. That's somebody who cared about the result. Now, let's talk about what that needle was actually making. Because for a long time, the assumption was survival clothing, thick furs, rough seams, pure function. But then researchers started looking at where the oldest decorated clothes come from, and they kept finding beads, shells, feathers sewn into fabric. That's not survival. Nobody needs a shell sewn into their coat to stay warm, but they did need something else. They needed to be seen a certain way. A soldier wears a uniform, not because it's comfortable. A priest wears robes, not because it's warm. And 50,000 years ago, someone threaded a bone needle with sinew and made the same calculation. What does this say about me? Now, back to the lice, because here's where it gets genuinely interesting. When the University of Florida team compared head lice DNA to body lice DNA, they found a clear genetic split. That split point is the moment one population of lice moved from hair to fabric, because body lice cannot survive anywhere else. No fabric, no colony, no genetic record. The lice kept the receipt. Honestly, respect. And the date they gave us, 170,000 years ago, was a problem for everyone who assumed clothes came from the cold, because the cold came 100,000 years later. Which means two things. First, clothes were invented for reasons that had nothing to do with temperature. Second, for 100,000 years, humans wore clothes in warm climates and chose to keep doing it. That's not accident. That's culture. Now here's a fair question. If it wasn't about cold, why did it start at all? The honest answer is we don't know exactly, and we probably never will. But the leading hypothesis is protection, not from cold, but from insects and sun damage. Sub-Saharan Africa, 170,000 years ago, had insects that could kill, flies that spread disease, mosquitoes, parasites. A layer of skin between you and those things is the difference between sick and alive. But then someone took that practical object and made it mean something more. Someone added a bead. Someone chose a better pelt. Someone wore theirs differently. And suddenly, it wasn't just protection, it was identity. Let's talk about how fast that shift happened, because it didn't take long. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute, studying burial sites across Eurasia, found something consistent. The oldest deliberate human burials, dating back to roughly 100,000 years ago, almost always included objects, tools, pigment, beads, and sometimes garments. When you bury someone with their clothes, you're saying something. You're saying those clothes were part of who they were, not just what they wore. That should make every person pause, because that's the moment clothing became something more than covering. It became a statement. Now you might be thinking, okay, but this was 100,000 years ago. What does any of this have to do with now? Here's the key. The psychological mechanism hasn't changed, not even slightly. In 2021, a study published in the Journal of Consumer Psychology tracked what happens to people's self-reported confidence when they wear formal clothes versus casual clothes. Formal clothes, higher confidence, more assertive decisions, broader thinking. Casual clothes, more relaxed, warmer, more empathetic. Same person, different clothes, different brain state. The anthropologists have a phrase for it: enclothed cognition. The idea that what you wear changes not just how others see you, but how you think. That is a direct line from a piece of animal skin 170,000 years ago to the suit you put on before a job interview. Same instinct, different fabric. Now let's talk about what happens when clothing starts to signal not just who you are, but which group you belong to, because that's where clothing gets really complicated. The earliest evidence of group-specific adornment comes from archaeological sites in Morocco. Nassarius shells, small, perforated, carried hundreds of kilometers from the coast, found in burial sites dating to 130,000 years ago. These weren't random, they were chosen, modified, and worn together. Researchers at the Max Planck Institute argue these shells are the earliest evidence of group identity markers. Not, I'm wearing this because I'm cold. I'm wearing this because I'm one of us. That finding destroyed the dominant narrative almost entirely. Clothing wasn't a response to nature. It was a response to other people. That's the real origin story, and it explains everything that came after. Uniforms that tell you who has authority. Dress codes that tell you where you belong. Logos that tell you what you can afford. All of it is the same signal those shells were sending 130,000 years ago. I'm one of us, and you're not. Now here's where I want to go back to those lice for a second, because the University of Florida study had a second finding. When researchers mapped the genetic tree of body lice globally, they found not one origin point, but two distinct population clusters. which suggests clothing may have been invented more than once, independently, in different parts of the world, by different groups of people, who all arrived at the same answer: cover yourself, and make it mean something. That's a remarkable thing. It means the instinct to use clothing as a social signal isn't cultural accident. It's something closer to a universal human drive. Like language, like music, every culture that has ever existed has worn something. Not every culture has had writing. Not every culture has had formal religion. But clothing? Yes. Every single one. That's not coincidence. That's biology meeting culture. Now let's get specific about what happened after that bone needle in Denisova Cave. Because 50,000 years ago, when humans start sewing, something dramatic changes. Before the needle, you wrap, you drape, you tie. After the needle, you cut, you fit, you shape. Think about what that actually means. Fitted clothing changes what clothing can signal, because now it can show the body. It can emphasize, exaggerate, conceal. And the moment clothing could do all that, it stopped being just social signal. It became self-construction, which, Aristotle would have said, separates humans from animals. Aristotle also thought women had fewer teeth than men, so we can take him or leave him. But the point stands. No other species has ever been observed using material objects to deliberately reshape how they are perceived by their group. That's exclusively human. And it started 170,000 years ago, with someone deciding a piece of animal skin said something about who they were. Now, here's what I find remarkable. We know more about the origin of clothing from lice DNA than from any physical artifact, because fabric decays, bone decays, skin decays, but lice kept their genetic record intact for 170,000 years. The most hated creature in human history turned out to be the most reliable witness to it. That finding destroyed most of what archaeologists assumed before 2011. Before the Florida study, the leading estimate for clothing was 40,000 to 70,000 years ago. The lice pushed that back by more than 100,000 years. More than 100,000 years of human history that we had simply missed. And when researchers looked at that extra window of time, they found something else. The 170,000-year figure lines up almost exactly with a period called a bottleneck event. Around 170,000 years ago, the human population may have dropped to as few as 10,000 individuals, 10,000 people. That's it. That's everyone. A single small town. And during exactly that crisis period, clothing appears. Which makes sense. When your group is that small, every signal matters more. Every marker of who's in and who's out becomes more important. Every piece of information about who someone is has to be read fast. You're 50 meters from a stranger. You have 2 seconds. Is he one of us? Clothing gave you the answer before he opened his mouth. And 170,000 years later, your brain is still running that same program. Every time you walk into a room and read who's there, you're doing exactly what your ancestors did in Africa in 170,000 BC, without a word, purely from what they were wearing. Here's something to sit with before we get to the end. The average American buys 68 new pieces of clothing per year. 68 pieces. The person in sub-Saharan Africa 170,000 years ago may have owned one, and they scraped it clean every time it got dirty. You have 68, and still go shopping because you have nothing to wear. The signal is the same. The volume is different. We didn't invent a new instinct. We just found more ways to feed it. And that brings us back to where we started. A warm afternoon, 170,000 BC. Someone wrapping an animal skin around themselves, not because they were cold, because they wanted to be seen a certain way. And 170,000 years later, you did the same thing this morning. You just had more options. What does what you're wearing right now say about you? Be honest. I read every single one.